A black executive, fresh off a week of grueling meetings where she advocated for equity and inclusion, stepped into the airport, ready to board her flight and finally unwind. But the moment she entered the terminal, everything changed. A flight attendant's subtle prejudice escalated into a humiliating confrontation in first class, questioning her right to even be there. What happened next shocked the entire cabin and set off a ripple effect no one could have predicted. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we dive in, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And if this story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that uncover the unseen truths of our world. It was just another ordinary flight. Until it wasn't. The airport terminal pulsed with its usual symphony of movement and sound. Voices echoed across the expanse as announcements overlapped with the rolling of suitcases and the rhythmic footsteps of hurried travelers. Naomi Evans moved through it all with the grace of someone who had long learned to navigate spaces that weren't designed with her in mind. She wasn't just another traveler. At 42, Naomi had carved out a path that defied expectations. A self-made entrepreneur turned major investor. Her presence in the boardrooms of corporate America was both a symbol of triumph and a constant reminder of how far society still had to go. She wore her success lightly. A tailored blazer, gold hoop earrings, and natural curls that framed the face bearing the quiet confidence of someone who had fought to belong. But in the public spaces she moved through, her wealth and status were often invisible, eclipsed by assumptions that clung to her like shadows. This morning was no different. At the gate, Naomi handed over her boarding pass with a practiced smile. The agent's glance lingered, just a beat too long, before waving her through with forced politeness. Naomi caught the subtle narrowing of the woman's eyes, the slight furrow of her brow. It was the look of someone trying to reconcile what they saw with what they thought they knew. Stepping onto the jet bridge, Naomi felt the usual tension settle over her. First class was familiar terrain. She'd occupied those seats many times before. And yet, the invisible walls that separated those who belonged from those who didn't seemed to tighten around her every time. As she entered the cabin, she noticed the way conversations softened and gazes flicked her way. Not long enough to be overt, but just enough to register. The older man in the corner seat glanced at her, then adjusted his cufflinks. A woman 2 rows ahead shifted her purse closer. The motion so automatic she likely didn't realize she'd done it. Naomi reached her seat, 1A, and began settling in. She pulled out her tablet and notebook. Her movements deliberate and measured. Years of experience had taught her that composure was its own form of armor. A way to deflect the subtle, probing scrutiny she could feel from every direction. The cabin filled with the quiet hum of activity as passengers took their places. Naomi heard fragments of conversation. Stock market trends, vacation plans, dietary preferences. It was a world she knew intimately, yet one where her presence often felt like an act of quiet defiance. A flight attendant approached. Her name tag read Susan, and her smile was polished but cool. Naomi recognized the type immediately. Susan exuded the kind of professional courtesy that could shift, imperceptibly, into condescension when challenged. "Excuse me, ma'am," Susan said, her tone light but firm. "May I see your boarding pass?" Naomi looked up, her expression calm. "Of course." She handed over the pass, her fingers steady even as a flicker of irritation tightened her chest. Susan examined it with unnecessary precision, her eyes flicking between the pass and Naomi. "Ah," she said finally, handing it back. "Thank you." Naomi gave a curt nod, watching as Susan moved on to the next passenger without the same scrutiny. She exhaled slowly, her fingers brushing against the notebook in her lap. Inside were her thoughts from a week of meetings with the airline's executives. Discussions about diversity, equity, and customer experience. Irony was a bitter taste on her tongue. Around her, the cabin hummed with quiet activity. Naomi sensed the tension that often lingered in spaces like this, where wealth and privilege were on full display but seldom questioned. The unspoken rules of belonging were written into every interaction, every sidelong glance. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Naomi leaned back in her seat, her mind already turning to the work ahead. She had learned long ago that progress came slowly, inch by inch, and often at great personal cost. But for now, she focused on the moment, on the quiet resilience that had carried her this far, and on the certainty that the challenges ahead would only sharpen her resolve. This was only the beginning. The engines hummed softly, filling the cabin with a steady rhythm that should have been soothing. Naomi Evans opened her notebook, the faint scent of leather rising as she smoothed the pages. She jotted down a few thoughts, her pen moving in precise strokes. But her mind wandered, unsettled by the lingering tension in the air. The woman across the aisle shifted in her seat, adjusting a silk scarf draped around her neck. Naomi noticed how the woman's eyes darted toward her, then away, as though Naomi's presence posed a question she didn't want to answer. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Naomi had seen it before. It was the same discomfort that lingered in boardrooms when she walked in. The unspoken question of how she had managed to occupy spaces so many believed weren't meant for her. Moments later, Susan, the flight attendant, reappeared, her heels clicking softly against the plush carpet. Naomi felt the shift in the air before Susan reached her seat. The practiced smile, the too-perfect posture, it all signaled an interaction Naomi could already predict. "Ms. Evans," Susan began, her voice laced with the kind of politeness that could cut. "I hate to trouble you, but it seems there's been a small issue with your seat assignment." Naomi set her pen down deliberately, looking up at Susan. "A small issue?" she asked, her tone calm but firm. "Yes," Susan said, hesitating just long enough to betray her discomfort. "It seems there's been an overbooking in first class. We may need to move you to a seat in the main cabin." Naomi held Susan's gaze, her expression unyielding. "My boarding pass says seat 1A. I selected this seat months ago. I'm not moving." Susan blinked, her smile faltering for the briefest moment. "I understand, but, no," Naomi interrupted, her voice low but resolute. "You don't understand. I'm staying in this seat." Susan stood frozen for a moment, then nodded stiffly. "Let me speak with my supervisor," she said, her words clipped, before retreating down the aisle. Naomi leaned back in her seat, her fingers gripping the edge of her notebook. She took a slow breath, steadying herself. This wasn't new. It had happened before, in different ways, in different spaces. The questions, the assumptions, the quiet insinuations that her presence was a mistake. She had grown accustomed to them, but that didn't make them any less exhausting. Around her, the cabin seemed quieter now. Passengers who had been immersed in their own worlds were suddenly paying attention. Naomi felt their eyes on her, the weight of their silent judgments pressing against her like a tangible force. The man in the row ahead turned his head slightly, just enough to catch a glimpse of her without being obvious. The woman with the silk scarf glanced her way again, her expression unreadable. Naomi resisted the urge to look away. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of shrinking under their scrutiny. The young black flight attendant Naomi had noticed earlier lingered near the galley, her gaze flickering toward Naomi before quickly returning to her task. Naomi caught her eye, and for a moment, they held each other's gaze. There was something in the woman's expression, a mix of recognition and quiet solidarity. Naomi offered her a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken bond they shared. Minutes later, Susan returned, this time with a man in a dark suit who carried himself with the air of someone used to being obeyed. His name tag read, David Mitchell. Supervisor. He stopped beside Naomi's seat, his hands clasped in front of him. "Ms. Evans," he began, his voice carefully measured. "I understand there's been a misunderstanding regarding your seat." Naomi arched an eyebrow. "Misunderstanding? My boarding pass says seat 1A. What exactly is unclear?" David hesitated, his composure cracking just slightly under the weight of Naomi's gaze. "We've had an overbooking situation, and we're trying to accommodate all our premium passengers." Naomi let out a quiet laugh, though there was no humor in it. "And you've decided that I'm the one who should move? Interesting." David shifted uncomfortably, the confidence in his stance faltering. "It's not personal, ma'am. We're just trying to resolve this as quickly as possible." Naomi leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a low, deliberate tone. "It's always personal, Mr. Mitchell, whether you admit it or not. You saw me, And you assumed I didn't belong here. That's personal. David opened his mouth to respond but said nothing. The silence stretched between them, heavy and charged. Around them, the other passengers sat frozen, their attention fixed on the unfolding scene. Naomi let the moment hang before leaning back in her seat. I'm not moving, she said firmly. If there's a problem, I suggest you find another solution. David hesitated again, then gave a tight nod. Of course, ma'am. Please excuse me. As he walked away, Naomi exhaled slowly, feeling the tension in her shoulders begin to ease. She knew this wasn't over. Men like David rarely let things go so easily. But for now, she had held her ground. The young black flight attendant reappeared, this time with a glass of water. She set it on Naomi's tray table with a quiet, "Here you go, ma'am." Her voice was soft, but there was something in her tone that felt like an act of defiance. "Thank you," Naomi said, meeting the woman's gaze. She saw the pride there, the silent admiration. It was a small gesture, but it mattered. As Naomi sipped the water, she glanced out the window. The plane was beginning to taxi toward the runway, the ground crew moving in a carefully choreographed dance below. The world outside felt distant, almost surreal, as though it belonged to a different reality. Inside the cabin, the tension remained, thick and unyielding. Naomi knew the coming hours would bring more challenges, more moments of quiet resistance. But she also knew this, she was not alone. And sometimes, that was enough. The plane was still climbing, the hum of the engines a constant undercurrent as the city below shrank into a patchwork of green and gray. The first-class cabin had settled into a fragile stillness. But it wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that carried weight, thick with tension and unspoken judgments. Naomi Evans sat motionless in her seat, the only sound coming from the faint scratch of her pen as she jotted notes in her leather-bound notebook. She felt their gazes before she saw them. The man across the aisle, who had been engrossed in the Wall Street Journal moments earlier, now seemed unusually interested in his watch. The older woman 3 rows ahead, with her pearl necklace and carefully coiffed hair, stole glances through the gap in the seats. Even the young tech entrepreneur a few rows back, who had been tethered to his phone since boarding, now watched her with thinly veiled curiosity. Naomi kept her expression neutral, but she felt the familiar burn rising in her chest. They weren't just watching her. They were assessing her, questioning her, measuring her against their assumptions. And in their silence, she could hear the words they weren't saying. Does she really belong here? Moments later, Susan returned, her heels clicking softly on the aisle carpet. Naomi looked up from her notes, bracing herself. Susan's smile was still plastered in place, but it looked thinner now, the corners tugging under the strain of discomfort. "Ms. Evans," Susan began, her tone a shade too bright. "I just wanted to make sure everything is to your satisfaction." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "It will be," she said coolly, "once we're in the air without further interruptions." Susan hesitated, her polished facade faltering for a fraction of a second. "Of course," she replied, before retreating to the galley with a stiffness that betrayed her unease. Naomi exhaled, closing her notebook with deliberate calm. She wasn't here to fight every battle, but she wouldn't let them take her dignity either. This, she knew, was the tightrope she walked every day, a balancing act between quiet resistance and self-preservation. The plane reached cruising altitude, and the cabin came alive with the muted sounds of flight attendants moving carts and passengers adjusting their seats. Naomi reached for her Kindle, determined to lose herself in the pages of a novel. But before she could begin, another voice cut through the quiet. "Excuse me, miss?" Naomi turned her head slowly. It was the man across the aisle, the one with the journal. His face was open, almost friendly, but there was something about his tone that set her on edge. "Yes," she replied, her voice measured. "I couldn't help but overhear earlier," he said, leaning slightly toward her. "Seems like there was a bit of confusion about your seat." Naomi's jaw tightened, but she didn't let it show. "Not confusion," she corrected. "Assumptions." The man blinked, taken aback by her directness. "Oh, I didn't mean, quote, I know what you meant," Naomi said, cutting him off gently but firmly. She returned her gaze to her Kindle. signaling the conversation was over. But the man wasn't done. It's just that, well, first class is certain expectations. He continued, his voice dropping as though sharing a secret. And not everyone understands that. Naomi turned to him fully now. Her Kindle forgotten. And what exactly are those expectations? She asked. Her tone sharp enough to make him sit back in his seat. He hesitated, his confidence slipping. You know, he said vaguely, gesturing around the cabin. A certain decorum. Naomi let his words hang in the air, heavy with their unspoken implications. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking onto him. Let me save you the trouble, she said quietly, but with steel in her voice. I meet every expectation you think you have. And then some. What you're questioning isn't my decorum. It's my presence. So, let's be honest about that. The man flushed, his face reddening as he stammered. I didn't mean, quote. But you did, Naomi said, cutting him off once more. She straightened in her seat, her expression calm but unyielding. And now you have something to think about. The man fell silent, his eyes darting to the window as though seeking escape. Naomi turned back to her Kindle, her heart pounding but her face composed. As the cabin settled again, Naomi noticed the young black flight attendant watching from the galley. Their eyes met, and the woman gave Naomi the smallest of nods. A gesture of solidarity that spoke volumes. Naomi returned the nod, her chest tightening with a mix of gratitude and resolve. The moment was interrupted by David, the supervisor, who appeared at the front of the cabin with a clipboard in hand. His demeanor was different now. Less confident, more hesitant. He glanced at Naomi but quickly looked away, addressing another passenger instead. Naomi watched him for a moment, her mind already turning. She knew what was coming. This wasn't over. It never was. But she was ready. She leaned back in her seat, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. The challenges would keep coming. She had no illusions about that. But she also knew her strength, her resilience, and she knew that every act of resistance, no matter how small, was a step towards something better. The plane hummed on, carrying its passengers through the clouds. The unspoken tensions of the cabin a mirror of the world below. Naomi closed her eyes, steadying herself for whatever came next. The clouds outside the window stretched like an endless sea, their soft edges illuminated by the pale glow of the midday sun. But inside the cabin, the atmosphere was taut, like a string pulled too tightly, one wrong note away from snapping. Naomi Evans felt it in the air, saw it in the quick glances passengers exchanged, the way conversations hushed whenever she shifted in her seat. This wasn't unfamiliar. This was the unspoken terrain she navigated daily. As the flight attendants began preparing for the meal service, Naomi caught a glimpse of David, the supervisor, conferring with Susan at the front of the cabin. Their expressions were serious, their conversation muted but deliberate. It wasn't hard to guess the topic. Naomi wasn't just a passenger anymore, she had become an event. A situation that needed managing. She turned her attention back to her notebook, forcing her thoughts to focus on the work at hand. The week's meetings had been grueling but necessary. A battle of wills against polite resistance. She had presented charts, studies, and testimonies, laying bare the systemic biases that affected everything from hiring practices to customer service. Yet even as board members nodded along, Naomi had seen the skepticism in their eyes, and heard it in their carefully worded responses. We appreciate your passion, one executive had said, his tone just patronizing enough to make her blood simmer. Passion, as though the fight for equity was a personal quirk, something to be tempered rather than a necessity. Now, miles above the earth, she was living the very biases she had fought to expose. The irony wasn't lost on her, but it did little to dull the sting. The meal cart arrived, and Susan was the one to deliver Naomi's tray. Her movements were brisk, her smile forced. Naomi could see the effort it took for her to maintain the veneer of professionalism. Here you go, Ms. Evans, Susan said, setting the tray down with precision. Let me know if you need anything else. Naomi looked up, meeting Susan's gaze. Actually, she said, her tone calm but pointed, I could use an update on the seat confusion from earlier. Has it been resolved? Susan hesitated, her fingers twitching slightly as she adjusted the edge of the tray. "It's all been sorted," she said, her smile faltering. "I apologize again for the inconvenience." Naomi studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Thank you." Susan hurried away, and Naomi turned her attention to the meal. It was the usual first-class fare. Salmon, a small salad, a warm roll, but Naomi had little appetite. The weight of the morning's events sat heavy in her stomach, making the thought of eating seem impossible. Halfway through the meal service, the murmurs began. It started quietly, a low hum of conversation from the rows ahead, but it grew louder with each passing minute. Naomi didn't need to hear the words to know what they were discussing. She had seen this before, the way unease bred whispers. How discomfort turned into quiet speculation. The man across the aisle was leaning toward his seatmate, his voice low but audible. "It's just unusual, don't you think?" he was saying. "You don't see that every day." The seatmate, a woman with sharp features and an air of old money, nodded slightly. "Quite. But you know how things are these days. Everyone's so sensitive." Naomi's grip on her pen tightened. She wanted to say something, to cut through their thinly veiled condescension with a truth so sharp it left no room for doubt. But she stayed silent, not out of fear, but out of exhaustion. She had spent a lifetime choosing her battles, and this wasn't one worth fighting. Not yet. Instead, she turned her attention to the young black flight attendant who had been hovering near the galley. The woman was busy rearranging cups on the drink cart, her movements precise but unhurried. Naomi could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her jaw tightened each time a passenger waved her over with a dismissive flick of the hand. Their eyes met briefly, and Naomi offered her a small, encouraging smile. The woman's lips curved slightly in response before she turned away, her expression guarded once more. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, jolting Naomi from her thoughts. The seatbelt sign dinged overhead, and the passengers shifted uneasily. The murmurs quieted, replaced by the occasional gasp or nervous laugh. Susan appeared again, moving through the aisle to ensure passengers were buckled in. She stopped by Naomi's seat, her professional mask firmly back in place. "Ms. Evans, is everything all right?" she asked, her tone practiced but lacking warmth. Naomi looked up at her, taking a moment before responding. "Everything's fine," she said. "Thank you." Susan hesitated, as though waiting for Naomi to say something more. When it didn't come, she nodded curtly and moved on. As the turbulence subsided, Naomi leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes for a moment. She could feel the weight of the stairs, the tension in the air that hadn't dissipated despite the flight's smooth return. It wasn't just her presence that unsettled them. It was what she represented. A disruption of their carefully curated world. A challenge to their unspoken rules of who belonged where. The plane cruised on, the cabin quiet once more. But Naomi knew the quiet wouldn't last. The challenges had only begun. And as the miles rolled on, she prepared herself for what was to come, knowing that every battle she faced wasn't just for her. It was for every person who had ever been told, in ways subtle and overt, that they didn't belong. The cabin's silence was deceptive. It was not the silence of contentment or calm, but the kind that carried weight, dense with the unspoken. Naomi Evans sat upright in her seat, her notebook now closed and her hands resting lightly on its cover. She could feel the tension like a current, running beneath the surface of everything. The sidelong glances, the muffled whispers, the way people seemed to shift their bodies as though creating an invisible boundary around her. The moment of peace was brief. Susan reappeared in the aisle, her steps deliberate, her face drawn into an expression that attempted poise but betrayed unease. Behind her was David, the supervisor, his brow furrowed with what looked like both frustration and resignation. Naomi's heart sank slightly. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. David stopped beside her seat, clipboard in hand, and cleared his throat. "Ms. Evans," he began, his tone strained with the effort of maintaining control. "I'd like to have a word with you, if I may, in private." Naomi set her jaw, her lips pressed into a thin line. "If you have something to say to me, Mr. Mitchell, you can say it here." David hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. He glanced around, as if weighing the opinions of the other passengers before proceeding. It's just a matter of protocol. He said carefully. There's been a report from one of our flight attendants about. Quote. A report? Naomi interrupted, her voice quiet but cutting. She leaned forward slightly, locking eyes with David. What exactly has been reported? Susan shifted uneasily behind him, her polished exterior cracking under the weight of the moment. David looked at her briefly, as though seeking confirmation, before returning his gaze to Naomi. There were concerns raised about your presence in first class, he said finally, his words slow and deliberate, as if testing their weight before releasing them. Naomi felt the air leave her lungs, a slow exhale that carried more than just her breath. She let the words sit there, heavy and unmistakable, before responding. Concerns, she said, her voice steady but sharp. What kind of concerns, exactly? David shifted again, clearly struggling. It's not about you personally, ma'am, he said, though the words rang hollow. It's just, quote. It's just what? Naomi pressed, her tone growing firmer. It's just that I don't fit someone's idea of who should be sitting here? The question hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. Around them, the cabin seemed to hold its collective breath. Even the passengers who had been pretending not to listen now turned their attention fully to the unfolding scene. I didn't say that, David said quickly, his voice defensive now, but we do have to address passenger concerns. Naomi's eyes narrowed. And did you consider for one moment that the concern wasn't about me, but about their own biases? Or is it easier to make me the problem? David opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Susan looked away, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere above Naomi's head. Naomi straightened in her seat, her composure unshaken. Let me make this clear, she said, her voice carrying just enough force to command attention without raising in volume. I have paid for this seat. I am entitled to sit in this seat. And I will not be moved because someone else is uncomfortable with the fact that I'm here. The tension in the cabin was palpable, thick enough to choke on. David hesitated for a moment longer, then gave a curt nod. Understood, ma'am, he said stiffly. Thank you for your cooperation. He turned and walked away, Susan trailing after him with a look of barely contained discomfort. As they disappeared toward the galley, Naomi allowed herself a small, controlled breath. It wasn't relief. Relief required the problem to be resolved. This was something else entirely. A pause. A reprieve. The murmurs began again, louder this time. Naomi could hear fragments of conversation behind her. Words like, overreaction, and, unnecessary, slipping through the gaps in the noise. She felt the weight of their judgment. The quiet condemnation of those who had chosen their own comfort over her dignity. The young black flight attendant emerged from the galley, her movements precise as she served drinks to the other passengers. Naomi watched her, noting the way she avoided eye contact with David and Susan, the way her lips pressed together as though holding back words she dared not say. When she reached Naomi's row, she paused, her hands steady as she set down a fresh glass of water. If you need anything, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, please let me know. Naomi looked up at her, their eyes meeting for a brief moment. There was something in her expression. An apology, perhaps, or a quiet acknowledgement of the battles they both fought. Naomi gave her a small nod. Thank you, she said simply. The woman lingered for just a second longer before moving on, her presence leaving a faint ripple in the tense atmosphere. Naomi turned her attention to the window, her reflection staring back at her against the backdrop of endless clouds. She thought about the man across the aisle, the passengers behind her, even Susan and David. They all played their roles in this familiar drama, this unspoken ritual of maintaining invisible boundaries. What they didn't realize, what they couldn't realize, was that those boundaries were already crumbling. Every stare, every whisper, every confrontation was another crack in the facade. Another step towards something different. Naomi wasn't just sitting in seat 1A. She was carving out space in a world that had tried, time and again, to deny her existence. And she wasn't done. The cabin was still, but not peaceful. It was the kind of silence that came after the opening notes of a conflict, when everyone involved was deciding whether to press forward or retreat. Naomi Evans remained seated, her back straight and her expression composed. but she could feel the tension growing like an invisible pressure. The plane, soaring high above the clouds, seemed to carry not just passengers, but the weight of history. A history that refused to stay buried. Naomi could see Susan in the galley, her movements quick and nervous as she busied herself with trivial tasks. David, the supervisor, stood nearby, speaking in hushed tones to another flight attendant. Their body language told the story, glances darting toward Naomi's seat. Shoulders tight with discomfort. She wasn't simply a passenger anymore. She had become a problem to solve. But Naomi wasn't new to this. She had long learned to read these spaces, to sense the currents of power and prejudice that ran beneath the surface. Her years in corporate America had been an education in subtlety. How bias could be cloaked in politeness. How exclusion could be framed as protocol. As she waited, the murmurs behind her grew louder. She caught snippets of conversation. Fragments that stung more for their familiarity than their content. "I just don't see why this is such a big deal," someone muttered. "It's not like she's being asked to leave the plane," another voice said, laced with exasperation. Naomi's jaw tightened. It wasn't the words themselves, but the casualness with which they were spoken, as though her right to sit in this space was a matter of debate. A trivial inconvenience rather than a fundamental issue of dignity. David appeared again, clipboard in hand and his face set in a neutral mask. He approached Naomi with the measured steps of someone walking a tightrope. "Ms. Evans," he began, his voice carefully controlled, "I wanted to personally apologize for any misunderstanding earlier. I assure you, this situation does not reflect our airline's commitment to excellent service." Naomi looked at him steadily. "Is that so?" she asked, her tone calm but pointed. "Because from where I'm sitting, it seems your commitment depends on who you're serving." David's composure faltered for a split second before he recovered. "I understand how this must feel," he said, "and I want to make it right." Naomi arched an eyebrow. "Do you?" He hesitated. The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications neither of them needed to voice. Around them, the cabin seemed to hold its breath, the other passengers straining to listen without appearing to. "What I want," Naomi continued, her voice steady, "isn't an apology. I want to know why my presence here was questioned in the first place. What exactly made me the subject of a concern?" David looked uncomfortable, his grip tightening on the clipboard. "I can't speak to individual passengers' concerns," he said, carefully sidestepping the question, "but I can assure you that our crew is committed to treating everyone with respect." Naomi's gaze didn't waver. "Respect," she repeated. "That's an interesting word. Tell me, Mr. Mitchell, does respect include assuming I don't belong in this seat? Does it include questioning me in front of an entire cabin, based on nothing but someone else's discomfort?" David's lips parted as though to respond, but no words came. Naomi let the silence linger, watching him grapple with the weight of her words. The young black flight attendant appeared then, her presence quiet but deliberate. She moved toward Naomi's seat with a glass of water, setting it down with a steady hand. Her name tag read Jasmine, and for the first time, Naomi noticed the flicker of determination in her eyes. "Thank you," Naomi said softly, meeting Jasmine's gaze. In that brief exchange, Naomi felt a current of solidarity, unspoken but unmistakable. Jasmine nodded slightly before retreating, her movements measured but purposeful. David cleared his throat, drawing Naomi's attention back to him. "Ms. Evans, I assure you, we take this matter seriously. If there's anything we can do to make your flight more comfortable." Quote, "There is," Naomi interrupted, her voice firm. "You can ensure this doesn't happen to anyone else. Not next week, not next month, not ever." David nodded, though the discomfort in his posture remained. "I'll make sure this is addressed," he said. "Thank you for bringing it to our attention." Naomi leaned back slightly, her gaze unwavering. "It shouldn't have needed to be brought to your attention. That's the point." The tension in the cabin shifted after that. It didn't disappear. These things never did. But it changed. The murmurs faded. The stares grew less frequent. Naomi could feel the other passengers recalibrating, adjusting their perceptions in the wake of the confrontation. She wasn't sure whether it was out of respect or fear. But for now, she didn't care. Silence, at least, was better than whispers. As the flight continued, Naomi let her mind wander. She thought about the boardroom discussions. The careful language executives used to avoid uncomfortable truths. She thought about the passengers who had stared at her earlier. Their judgment as reflexive as breathing. She thought about Jasmine, standing in the galley with quiet strength. And the countless others like her who navigated these spaces every day. This wasn't just about a seat. It never was. It was about power. About who was allowed to claim space without question and who had to fight for it. It was about the thin veneer of politeness that masked deeper truths. The way prejudice could be dressed up as procedure. Naomi closed her eyes briefly, letting the hum of the engines fill her ears. The battle wasn't over. Not here, not anywhere, but for now, she has won this round. And that, she decided, was enough. The cabin hummed with a forced calm. An uneasy truce settled over its rows. Naomi Evans sat upright in her seat, her hands resting lightly on the edges of her notebook. Her gaze fixed on the horizon of clouds outside the window. But her mind wasn't quiet. It churned with questions, each one pushing against the thin veneer of civility that had settled over the situation. She had won a momentary reprieve. Yes. But the stares, the whispers, the discomfort lingering in the air. They were still there, unresolved, simmering just beneath the surface. David, the supervisor, had retreated to the galley. And Naomi could see him through the corner of her eye. His body language was tight. His shoulders hunched as he spoke in hushed tones with Susan. Their conversation carried no sound. But Naomi didn't need to hear the words to know what they were discussing. She could feel it in the way Susan's eyes darted toward her. The way David gestured toward the front of the cabin. What now? That was the question. It always was. What to do about a problem that wasn't truly a problem, but one that disrupted the delicate balance of comfort and power? Naomi wasn't here to play the role they expected. The quiet, accommodating passenger who would apologize for the inconvenience of existing. No, she wasn't here to make them comfortable. She was here to make them see. As Naomi leaned back in her seat, she felt the familiar prickle of eyes on her. She glanced across the aisle and met the gaze of the older woman with the pearl necklace. The woman's expression was a curious mix of embarrassment and defiance, as though she was caught between wanting to look away and needing to hold her ground. Naomi didn't blink. She met the woman's gaze head-on, unflinching, until the older woman finally looked away, her cheeks flushing pink. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. The man across the aisle, who had been so quick to make assumptions earlier, was now deeply engrossed in his newspaper. Or at least, he pretended to be. Naomi could see the way his eyes flicked toward her every few seconds. The faint tension in his posture. It wasn't long before Jasmine, the young black flight attendant, appeared again. This time, she moved with quiet determination. Her presence calm but purposeful as she approached Naomi's seat. "Ms. Evans," Jasmine said softly, her voice steady but carrying a note of something unspoken. "Is there anything else I can get you?" Naomi looked up at her, seeing not just the question but the weight of everything Jasmine couldn't say aloud. It was in the slight tension of her shoulders, the way her fingers gripped the edge of the drink tray. "No, thank you," Naomi said, her tone warm but firm. "I'm fine." Jasmine nodded, but she lingered for a moment, her gaze meeting Naomi's. It was brief, but in that moment, Naomi saw everything. The solidarity, the quiet resistance, the exhaustion of navigating these spaces day after day. She nodded back, a silent acknowledgement of their shared understanding. As Jasmine moved away, Naomi felt a flicker of hope. It was faint, but it was there. Sometimes, that was enough. The cabin began to settle again, passengers turning back to their own distractions. But Naomi knew the silence was only temporary. These moments always were. And then, as if on cue, the first crack appeared. "Excuse me," came a voice, loud enough to cut through the low hum of conversation. Naomi turned her head to see the man across the aisle, his newspaper folded neatly on his lap. He was leaning slightly toward her, his expression cautious but intent. "Yes?" Naomi said, her voice measured. The man hesitated for a moment, as though weighing his next words carefully. "I just wanted to say, well, I didn't mean to offend you earlier. If I did, Naomi arched an eyebrow. If you did? The man flushed slightly, but he pressed on. What I mean is, I think there's been a lot of misunderstanding here today. People just aren't used to. He stopped himself, realizing too late the implication of his words. Used to what? Naomi asked, her voice calm but sharp. Seeing someone like me in first class? The man's flush deepened. That's not what I meant. He stammered. People make assumptions. It's not right, but it happens. Naomi held his gaze for a long moment before responding. You're right, she said finally. It's not right. And it doesn't just happen. It's taught. It's reinforced every day, in ways big and small. People like you don't even realize you're doing it, because you've never had to think about it. The man looked down at his hands, his confidence crumbling under the weight of her words. Around them, the cabin was deathly quiet. The other passengers pretending not to listen but failing miserably. Naomi let out a slow breath, feeling the tension in her chest ease slightly. She wasn't angry, not anymore. What she felt was something deeper, something heavier. It was the weariness of having to explain, again and again, what should have been obvious. She turned her attention back to the window, the clouds outside glowing with the golden light of the setting sun. The conversation wasn't over, not with this man, not with anyone, but for now, she was content to let the silence speak for itself. In the galley, Jasmine watched the scene unfold from a distance, her expression unreadable, but as Naomi met her gaze one last time, she saw it, the faintest flicker of a smile. And in that moment, Naomi knew she wasn't alone. The cabin was bathed in the warm hues of a descending sun, casting long shadows across the plush leather seats. Naomi Evans gazed out of the window, the clouds below resembling islands adrift in an infinite sea. The air inside the plane had grown quieter, but not peaceful, more like the silence that followed a storm, heavy with the residue of what had passed. She could feel the weight of the day pressing on her, a familiar burden she carried not only for herself but for everyone who had ever been told, explicitly or implicitly, that they didn't belong. The seatbelt light dinged, and passengers stirred in their seats, preparing for the final descent. Yet Naomi felt the tension in her chest tighten. The challenges of this journey had not ended, they rarely did. David returned, his expression carefully neutral but betraying traces of unease. He lingered near Naomi's seat for a moment, then crouched slightly, lowering his voice. Ms. Evans, he began, I want to apologize again for everything that's happened. This situation has been a learning experience for us all. Naomi turned to him, her gaze steady. She didn't respond immediately, letting the silence settle between them. David shifted uncomfortably, the faint flush in his cheeks deepening under her scrutiny. A learning experience, Naomi repeated finally, her tone even. Tell me, Mr. Mitchell, what exactly have you learned? David hesitated, his composure faltering. That we need to be more mindful, he said carefully, that biases, unconscious or otherwise, have no place in how we serve our passengers. Naomi studied him for a moment longer, then nodded. Good, she said simply. Then let me offer you a lesson to take back to your team. David nodded eagerly, reaching for the tablet he had tucked under his arm. Naomi watched him, a faint smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Not out of amusement, but out of recognition. She had seen this before, the scramble to make amends, the desperate attempt to neutralize discomfort without confronting its root. Your problem, Naomi continued, her voice measured but firm, is that you think bias only exists when it's visible, when it's loud. But the most insidious kind lives in the quiet assumptions. In the way you looked at me and decided I didn't fit here. It lives in every moment you choose to appease the discomfort of some passengers over the dignity of others. That's what you need to address. Not just for me, but for everyone who walks onto one of your planes. David nodded again, his pen poised over the tablet. Thank you, Ms. Evans, he said. I'll make sure your feedback is shared. Naomi let out a small laugh, though it held no humor. It's not feedback, Mr. Mitchell, she said. It's reality, and it's time you stopped treating it like a suggestion. As David retreated, Naomi leaned back in her seat, exhaling deeply. Her hands rested lightly on the edges of her notebook. But she didn't open it. Instead, She let her thoughts wander, tracing the path that had brought her here. Not just to this flight, but to this moment in her life. She thought of the countless boardrooms where she had sat, the subtle shifts in tone when she spoke, the questions that seemed to challenge her very presence. She thought of the polite rejections, the constructive feedback, the coded language that told her she was too much and not enough all at once. And she thought of the younger Naomi, the girl who had first dared to dream beyond the limits the world had placed on her. That girl would have looked at this moment and seen it as a triumph. But for the woman Naomi had become, it felt like something else, a reminder of how much work still lay ahead. The descent began, and the plane shuddered slightly as it passed through a layer of turbulence. Naomi glanced around the cabin, observing the passengers who had spent the flight in varying degrees of discomfort, curiosity, and judgment. Some still avoided her gaze, while others offered hesitant smiles that felt more like olive branches than genuine warmth. Across the aisle, the older woman with the pearl necklace leaned slightly toward Naomi. Her expression was tentative, but there was a softness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "Ms. Evans," the woman said quietly, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engines. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry." Naomi turned to her, arching an eyebrow. "For what, exactly?" she asked. The woman hesitated, her cheeks flushing slightly. "For the way you were treated," she said finally, "and for my own assumptions. I think I needed to see this." "To see you?" Naomi regarded her for a long moment, then nodded. "Thank you," she said simply. The woman sat back, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. It wasn't much, Naomi thought, but it was something, and sometimes, something was enough. As the plane touched down, the passengers stirred, gathering their belongings and preparing to disembark. Naomi waited, letting the crowd thin before rising from her seat. She moved deliberately, her steps measured as she retrieved her bag from the overhead compartment. Jasmine stood near the exit, her posture straight but her eyes warm as she watched Naomi approach. When their eyes met, Jasmine gave her a small, encouraging nod. "Thank you," Naomi said softly as she passed, her voice carrying more weight than the words themselves. Jasmine's smile widened, just slightly. "No," she replied. "Thank you." The terminal was alive with motion, its wide corridors echoing with the sounds of hurried footsteps and muffled announcements. Naomi walked through it with the same quiet confidence she had carried onto the plane. Her shoulders squared, her head held high. This wasn't the end of the journey. It never was. But as she stepped into the bright light of the terminal, she felt a spark of something that had eluded her for much of the flight. Hope. Not the naive hope of expecting the world to change overnight, but the steady, resilient kind, the hope that came from knowing her presence, her resistance, had left a mark, that the cracks in the facade, however small, were there, and through them, the light could begin to seep in.